neoliberal view was basically that the world was binary. You had Western-style democracies on one end, and you had illiberal or authoritarian regimes on the other. That's it. All human beings essentially want to live in a democracy according to this view. Interconnectivity, globalization, far from streamlining development along a very specific linear path, would actually create the opposite. It would create adaptive systems that would diverge, that would go in different ways. And this is exactly what has happened in China. This is why China is advancing in the world and other powers in the East, because the concept of who they are is very clear. Welcome back to Men and the City. I hope you're all doing well. It is a sublime day here, although a bit cold in Mexico City, but I thought it was a perfect opportunity to have an outdoor chat and probably the last video of the year about the rise of the East. So today's video is going to be called "What the West Gets Wrong About China is What It Gets Wrong About Itself." So as most of you know, I have written extensively about the rise of BRICS, but I couch that within a broader recognition that the East in general, the non-West, if you will, is accumulating power. It's gaining in strength. Its sense of national consciousness, and I emphasize national, is growing. You might even say civilizational sense, and we're going to come back to that point in just a moment. But what's so striking about the rise of the East is how utterly befuddled, perplexed, confounded, and completely ignorant people in the West are about what is happening in the East. This is a persistent theme that I have observed. It's especially the case in Washington, D.C., New York City, Brussels, places of that nature. But I would say, categorically speaking, in most academic institutions in the Western world, in the cognitive elite, if that's what you want to call it, there's a complete lack of understanding of what's happening in the East. That is the subject of today's video. If you go back to 1989, there was a term coined by an economist named John Williamson called the Washington Consensus. This is right around the time that Francis Fukuyama released a book called The End of History, which was sort of a celebration of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the triumph of Western-style democracy as the last form of government that would spread around the world. At the same time, there was another book written addressing similar themes, but in a different light, called The Clash of Civilizations, written by Samuel Huntington. Very famous book that a lot of people talk about. But unfortunately, most of these accounts really didn't understand exactly what was about to happen, although I would say Huntington came closest. In any case, the Washington Consensus became sort of the paradigm through which most Western elites, technocrats, bureaucrats, policymakers, etc., formulated their understanding of not just the world, but of the development process in general. And the Washington Consensus, just to be very clear, was basically about three things: privatize, liberalize, and globalize. The three prongs, if you will, that have driven the United States economy into the ditch, deindustrialized Europe, and have flooded the Western world with non-Western peoples. So it's been, I would say, a very self-destructive paradigm in the West, never mind the damage that it's done to non-Western countries through the IMF and the World Bank. There was a book written about that subject a couple decades ago by Joseph Stiglitz called Globalization and Its Discontents. So I highly recommend you take a look at that. In any case, what this Washington Consensus was a part of was the neoliberal view. And the neoliberal view was basically that the world was binary. You had Western-style democracies on one end, and you had illiberal or authoritarian regimes on the other. That's it. Such a bifurcation continues to drive Western foreign policy today. This is the nature of the characterization of Vladimir Putin and Russia, or Xi Jinping in China, or the North Koreans. All are sort of lumped together in this broader category of authoritarian states. Of course, such a category is ridiculous, doesn't exist. Authoritarianism is just not a very appropriate or accurate framework to understand any of these countries that are radically different, that have very different interests. In addition to the neoliberal order and the Washington Consensus, you also had this concept of essentialism. Basically, there were two views of democracy. Democracy as a universal paradigm, as an expression of humanity's tendency. This is, again, institutionalized in the Western world. All human beings essentially want to live in a democracy according to this view. They want freedom of speech. They want individual rights. They want limited government. They want to vote for their leaders, etc. Of course, if you look at the facts of the matter, if you evaluate public opinion and you look at the structure of most countries in the world, they have nothing to do with that paradigm whatsoever. But universalism rejects that and basically says democracy is essentially where we're headed. Again, channeling that Washington Consensus, the neoliberal view, as well as Fukuyama's end of history. Essentialism, however, was quite different. Essentialism said that actually democracy is quite conditional. Now, some folks would say it's conditional on prosperity or it's conditional on economic liberalism. This is why some people have argued that once China reached a certain GDP, it would become democratic. Of course, we know that's not true. It hasn't been true around the world, but especially not in China. You might even say it's not true in the Western world. Today, it seems, trending away from the neoliberal paradigm in the West. But essentialism also, in some corners, a corner that I'm in, argued that democracy is unique. It is peculiar to Western peoples. That is certainly my view, and that's something I'm going to come back to in just a moment. However you want to slice it, these views all essentially added up to the same thing, which is that the United States had sort of figured out the recipe of modernity, and the West more generally, and there was only one way to do things. And so what we had to do as Western peoples was shepherd the rest of these countries along this path to facilitate their development and to integrate them into a broader rules-based order.
The assumption of the West was that if China succeeded, it could only succeed by becoming a replica of a Western society.
At the same time, however, there is this alternative view, this alternative concept called divergent evolution. Divergent evolution is a principle that comes from biology, but a former professor of mine, a guy named Hilton, who I strongly encourage you to look up, wrote extensively on this topic as it pertains to political systems and specifically international systems, especially in terms of East versus West. That actually, in Hilton Root's view, interconnectivity, globalization, far from streamlining development along a very specific linear path, would actually create the opposite. It would create adaptive systems that would diverge, that would go in different ways. And this is exactly what has happened in China. China has diverged, and that divergence started in the 1980s. Now, a lot of people will tell you that effectively what the Chinese have done is adopted capitalism with some minor tweaks, or some would call it state capitalism. Yes and no.
Deng Xiaoping says, come on, China's got to do much better than this. And so he makes two fundamental reforms. One, he redefines Chinese socialism as not just the state and the plan, but also the market. And secondly, he said, until then, China being pretty autarkic, China should be part of the world, should integrate itself.
If you read the Chinese documents, and I strongly encourage you to read Made in China 2025, there is a discussion of exactly how the West developed. And the Chinese view is quite different than our view. They don't believe that our prowess, that our power in the world today is derived from democracy or liberalism at all. Rather, they see things in terms of industry and economic capacity or technology. And their view is that that was centered in manufacturing. If you read Made in China 2025, this is the way they express it. Manufacturing is the mainstay of the national economy, the basis on which the nation is established, an instrument of rejuvenation and the foundation of a world power. Since the beginning of industrial civilization in the middle of the 18th century, the history of the rise and fall of world powers and the history of the struggle of the Chinese nation has repeatedly proved that without a strong manufacturing industry, there will be no country and no nation. Building an internationally competitive manufacturing industry is the only way China can enhance its comprehensive national strength, ensure national security, and build itself into a world power. Now, further on in the document, they expound upon exactly how to do that, but whenever they talk about technology, industry, recruiting talent, encouraging innovation, they always add a phrase, with Chinese characteristics. Now, why do they do that? Because the Chinese recognize intuitively that they are fundamentally different from Westerners.
That after having the oldest continuous civilization in the world, the Chinese have worked out their own political history, their own political traditions, their own political culture. And they know what works for China and what doesn't work for China.
And of course, they are right. Ironically enough, people in the West, who, as I said, are confounded by what's happening in China, refuse to accept that basic principle or premise through which to understand the world, namely that people are fundamentally different and that the Chinese are fundamentally different from Westerners and Westerners are fundamentally different from the Chinese. The same goes for folks in Latin America, for people in India. These are radically different peoples that will never accept, full stop, Western style democracy, liberalism, so forth and so on. They will assimilate divergent models. Doesn't mean that they'll reject outright Western concepts. They will simply assimilate those concepts within their own peculiar ways. This is what the Chinese call Chinese characteristics. What we have to understand about the East, what we have to understand about ourselves, is ultimately that social contracts are not defined by slips of paper like the Constitution. They are an agreement, an unspoken covenant, if you will, between the state, could be the nation state, could be institutions of various forms, and the people. To take China as an example, there is a social contract in China. Again, people in the West, the technocrats, bureaucrats, policymakers, etc., don't understand that because they're looking for some kind of myopic document that instantiates and lays these things out, like the Constitution. But as I said, a social contract is not embedded in a body of text. It's not about a specific set of rules or regulations like the Constitution. It is an unspoken covenant between the people and the state. In China, that social contract is that the central government, be that an emperor or the Chinese Communist Party, has an obligation to fulfill two mandates. One is to guarantee the stability of China. So whatever the regime does, it cannot cause chaos, upheaval, revolution, social disruption whatsoever. And if it does those things to a great extent, in such a way that upsets the equilibrium of the Chinese people, it will lose its mandate. The second pillar, the second mandate, if you will, is prosperity. The emperor secures his mandate of heaven by guaranteeing the prosperity of his people, by improving their standard of living, by ensuring that the average Chinese household is taken care of. Now again, these things are not written down per se. There's no contract that drives this, but it's a social contract that exists in the souls, in the minds, in the unspoken covenant between the Chinese people and the authority. It is for this reason that the Chinese Communist Party today is actually very popular.
You see, we think that unless these countries like China have a multi-party system and universal suffrage, then they can't be democratic and the people, therefore, can't be happy. And I'm sorry, just open your eyes. You know, I mean, they are very happy with the country. They are very pleased with it.
And is gaining in credibility because over the last 40 years, the Chinese have done an expert job with all kinds of problems, to be sure, of facilitating the modernization of the average Chinese. That is their responsibility, and maintaining stability in the process. The dual mandate, stability and prosperity. To understand the Chinese, you have to remember that everything is seen through the prism of filial piety and what's called guanxi. Filial piety being the parent-child relationship, the respect for hierarchy. This is the way the Chinese view Hong Kong. This is the way the Chinese view Macau and Taiwan. Ultimately, the parent is China, the nation, and the children are these sort of outliers that have to return to the parent. This explains the Chinese mindset, their approach, their strategy. They don't want to wage wars of conquest. They just want to reintegrate the Chinese household, which is centered in the Chinese mainland on the one hand, but the children, if you will, in places like Taiwan, they need to come home. Guanxi, on the other hand, is about relationships. And that relationship is not simply between Chinese and state, or between household and individual, or between China as a mainland entity and Taiwan, for example. It is also about China's relationship to the rest of the world. The same mandates that exist domestically are also externalized for the Chinese. In other words, they want continuity. They want stability and prosperity. They want a relationship, and that relationship must be governed by those mandates. As Westerners, we can't possibly fathom these things because to us, they have to be enshrined in contracts, international law, things of that nature. Furthermore, we think exclusively in terms of power. Notice power wasn't really expressed in my characterization of the Chinese and their mindset. That's a Western concept.
That is the cynical, realist school of thought of American geopolitics, that America, in this anarchic world, because they don't really believe in God, they don't believe there is a God that will help them, they think that they must be the nastiest, biggest bully in the world in order to defend themselves. Their survival as a nation and their prosperity will depend on their capacity to bully everybody else and from preventing anyone who is getting too big for their boots to become an equally sized bully. And they will say to you that they were bullies around the world, like, for instance, Imperial Japan, Imperial Germany, the Soviet Union, and what the United States have succeeded in doing is effectively eliminating them, annihilating them, getting them out of the way. And that now China is rising, China is next. And therefore that explains the new Cold War.
We transfer, if you will, our concepts of power, our drive to dominate other parts of the world, intellectually, imperialistically, economically, and otherwise, onto the Chinese. But that's not their motivation at all. For them, the sun rises and sets in China. They have their cohesive universal whole. It's embedded in the Chinese people. They're not interested in assimilating the rest of the world. They don't believe that non-Chinese can be Chinese, any more than most of the non-Western world believes that people that are different ethnically than them can be them. Again, that is a Western concept only. What's the point of all this? Well, we are going into a new world order, and this new world order, as it stands today, is going to be radically different, an inversion of what we've got today. The days of globalization, of Western hegemony, economically, politically, intellectually, etc., are over. The world is, in effect, reverting back to what it has been historically, a multipolar world driven by divergent evolution with co-evolution and adaptive systems that look radically different than one another. this sort of top-down globalist vision of enforced homogeneity according to the liberal democratic paradigm. The progressive narrative, if you will, that's dead. It's over. But it's not completely vanquished yet, as we know. This is to some degree what explains the conflict in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East, or the tension between China and the United States. This tension exists between the multipolarity, the coevolution, the divergent paths of modernization on the one hand, and the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal order on the other. These two ideas talk completely past one another. But nonetheless, that's where we're headed. Now, what does this say about us as Americans? China's orientation, it's the expression of its mandates, its social contract, is different. But fundamentally speaking, the Chinese understand who they are. Remember that Samuel Huntington said that national interests come from national identity. This is why China is advancing in the world and other powers in the East, because the concept of who they are is very clear. In the West, we've lost our sense of national identity because we have abandoned the fundamental building blocks of who we are, namely the people. If China is Han Chinese, and it is, what is America? America is a Celtic nation, founded, built, etc. by Anglo-Protestants who essentially assimilated non-Anglos into that paradigm. America is a Celtic nation at its core. And that Celtic nation is what explains the social contract that we demand in the United States. We demand a trade-off, if you will, between the power of the state and the power of the individual. We demand individual rights, freedom of speech, separation of church and state, etc., etc. These are principles that are strongly embedded in the Celtic psyche of the United States. It's why we have such a reverence for rugged individualism. It's also why the rest of the world does not, because the rest of the world fundamentally is not the construct of the Celtic psyche or the Celtic people, which is what the United States is. I say that because China, being the longest running ethno-state in human history, dating back thousands of years, has basically gone through different iterations.
Now look at China. Most countries then have maybe 1, 2 periods of global eminency or even preeminence. China, you have the Han, part of the Han period, then you have the Tang period, then in some respects the Song dynasty period, then you have the Ming period and a bit of the Qing. China's had at least 5 periods in its history where it has been the most advanced or one of the most advanced civilizations in the world.
We call them dynasties, to be sure, but they're just different manifestations of that Chinese ethnos. But the continuity is the Chinese people themselves. The United States is not different in that sense. As I said, we're a Celtic nation. So is the United Kingdom. We are another, in other words, iteration of the British Empire or of the United Kingdom. And many of the principles that govern who we are come from the wellspring of that European civilization. So seen from that vantage point, we're actually very similar to these powers rising in the East. We've just forgotten ourselves. We have succumbed to this intellectual narcissism. And of course, we know that it's been imposed upon us to a large extent by a globalist elite intent on destroying us, replacing us demographically and otherwise. In any case, once we can regain a sense of who we are, in terms of our real national identity, the fundamental character of who we are, that will enable us to have better relations with the rest of the world and to better understand and contextualize the Chinese and others in the East who are centered fundamentally in their national identity and consciousness. They have not lost sight of that. If anything, they've activated it. The dynamic between these two things, the neoliberal order, the decline of the Washington Consensus, and the rise of this multipolarity, this coevolution, this divergence of economic modernization and national consciousness is happening in the East, is going to play itself out this decade. And it's going to prevail. The multipolarity is going to win out. The unipolar moment, whatever we want to call it, is over. Neo-masculinity is going to favor prominently in this process because it's going to recenter the United States in that true Celtic character of the past, albeit with a new, adaptive, modern version of it. This is the future. And so understanding the East, in some sense, is key to understanding the West, to understanding who we are to this very day. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.